On a personal note, that song, Now I Believe in Jesus, was written by my father about 40 years ago. I remember when I looked at the song and I went through all 4 verses of it, I said to my dad, I said, that tells the story of Jesus. When our grandson, Ryder, when I asked him about leading this morning and leading that song, he said, all 4 verses? Yeah, it tells the story of Jesus. I'm very thankful that we're here today to worship God. It's really a pleasure to have our grandson involved in this morning, leading us in a song that his grandfather wrote. It began with this. Jesus came down from heaven doing his Father's will. Jesus said, as we find recorded in John chapter 6, verse 38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Early on, he came to be about his Father's business. I'd like for you to open your Bibles to Luke chapter 2. As I read that in just a moment, Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 50. I want to read this because we can go back to when Jesus was a boy, traveling with his family, with his parents to Jerusalem every year, as their custom was. Probably a trip that they all looked forward to, traveling from Galilee down to Judea. And we find in verse 41, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. And when they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother did not know it. But supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and friends. So when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. Now so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And so when they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said to him, Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously. You can just hear a mother saying, you have worried us to death. We have been looking for you. When I read that, I'm reminded of times when we have lost our children or our grandchildren, and we began to look for them, and we were just worried all to death about that. Concerned. Here was a mother and a father that were concerned about their 12-year-old son. But here's what he said to them. Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? But they did not understand the statement which he spoke to them. Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? His Father was in heaven, and he had come down from heaven to do his Father's will. During his ministry, he spoke of the Jews destroying the temple of his body by lifting up the Son of Man. In John chapter 2, after the cleansing of the temple, you may recall, he answered and said to them, to the Jews, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They didn't know what he was talking about. We find in chapter 3 where Jesus told Nicodemus, a Pharisee, a ruler of the Jews, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Again, people did not understand what he was talking about. He did. He came from heaven. And later he warned his disciples, as we find recorded in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, when he said to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the 3rd day. They don't understand. He does. He came from heaven. When I think about suffering many things, those many things would include things like scourging. We find in chapter 20 of the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus says, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify. And the third day he will rise again." We dread the pain of surgery, even when we know ahead of time that the doctor is going to take care of that. I never will forget when a doctor said to me before I had rotator cuff surgery years ago, he called me in to talk to me about the surgery, and he asked me this question: "How much pain medicine do you want?" And I was startled. I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "How much pain medicine do you want?" And I answered very quickly, "I want all you got." He said, "Well, we can take care of that." I said, "Good. Most normal people do not want to go through pain." Can you imagine Jesus living his life here on earth, knowing that one day scourging and crucifixion awaits him? No doubt, he knowing that he would rise from the dead strengthened him. However, it did not keep him from being troubled at the thought of this hour. We're reminded of that in Matthew chapter 26. When Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane that night to pray, and he took 3 of his disciples with him, Peter and the sons of Zebedee, and he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Deeply grieved, sorrowful, distressed, to the point of intense praying that it might pass from him. In John chapter 12, verse 27, we find where he said to them, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour." He knew what his purpose was all about. After all, he came from heaven. He came down from heaven, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Jesus said in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." We can find in Luke 24, verse 44, when Jesus said, "The law, the prophets, and the Psalms all speak concerning me." When he was arrested that night in the garden, now just think about this. Here come the enemies of Jesus coming into the garden that night. They were sent there by the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin Council. "Go in there and get this man." And here they're coming into the garden with lanterns and torches, with weapons, with clubs and swords. They're coming in there to take him, and they laid their hands on him and they took him. They didn't come in there saying, "Excuse me, we would like for you to come with us." And no, they took him because they wanted Jesus taken out. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to kill him. And surely it was no gentle procedure. And all through the night, before the Jews turned him over to the Romans the next morning, they tried him. My understanding, they tried him at least 3 times during the night, illegally. But they were trying him. And during the night, we find in Mark chapter 14 and verse 65 that some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. You know, at this point, those followers of his forsook him, and they left him behind. And we find over in Matthew chapter 26, where Jesus said, "But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." He knew what his purpose was about. He knew it was a fulfillment of prophecy. He came from heaven. Well, The next morning he was taken to Pilate. Pilate found no wrong with him, the Roman governor. And so he sent him over to Herod, who had jurisdiction over Galilee. And he sent him to Herod, and we find in Luke 23, verse 11, that Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt, and they mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate didn't want him back, but he got him. And so what do we find Pilate doing then? In John 19, verse 1, he took Jesus and he scourged him. Folks, if you read about the scourging of the Romans, some of you have, I'm sure, it was brutal. Brutal. They would take the victim, the one that they wanted to scourge, and strip them of their clothing. In many cases, they would tie them to a low post with their exposed back. And the one with the whip, a short-handed whip with the leather strips attached to it, jagged bone or metal, to inflict the most severe punishment to the body that can be imagined. Just shredding the body, tearing it up. And this was before a nail was ever driven into his hands and feet. Then Pilate's soldiers, they completed the mockery with a crown of thorns. A crown of thorns. They just didn't place the crown of thorns on his head gently. What we find in John 19, verse 2 through 3, the soldiers twisted it. A crown of thorns, and he put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. And then Pilate, he sentenced him to be crucified. In John 19, verse 17, and he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, Calvary. And the Roman soldiers nailed him to a cross and began the death watch. Here he is outside the city of Jerusalem, on a hill, a place of suffering and sacrifice. His quicker than normal death took most of the day, prevented them from breaking his legs. Some attribute the hastiness of his death to the ordeal leading to his crucifixion. Probably it played a part in this. But remember about Jesus, he was unique. We find in John 10, verse 17 through 18, where Jesus said, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father." And once he had completed God's plan for him, he yielded his spirit to the Father. But you know what happened next? Someone down on the ground with a spear comes up from the ground with a spear, and they thrust it into his side to ensure that the gruesome task was done. Oh, they bound the hands of Jesus in the garden where he prayed. Several years ago, my wife, Vicki, and I were in Tucson, Arizona for a gospel meeting. We were introduced to a man and his wife, fellow Christians that were living in the United States, waiting to become citizens. They came from South Africa. He was a well-known artist in South Africa for his artwork, his portraits, paintings of landscape, wildlife. But they settled in the southwest part of our country, an area that our family is very familiar with, being out in the desert, beautiful landscape, beautiful blue skies off in the background on the horizon, mountains, just beautiful. But Brother Garrick, he was really interested in painting the Old West. And one night we went over there after services and we wanted to look at his artwork, and we went into his studio, and as we're looking around, we're seeing these portraits of cowboys and Indians, buffalo. I mean, it was just amazing. And we were just so in awe of what this man was able to accomplish. No wonder he was well known in South Africa. But then Vicki was behind me and she gasped. And I turned around to see, what has gotten your attention? It was this portrait of what Brother Garrick had done, of what he pictured in his mind, of what Jesus must have looked like on the cross. It was much larger than this. And really, when you look at the entire drawing, the painting, the body was so torn up from all that had happened to Jesus before he was nailed to the cross. And I asked this brother, did you get this idea from another painting, from another artist? No. He said, I read the Gospels from the time that Jesus was betrayed in the garden until he went to the cross. And he said, I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I just imagined in my mind what he must have looked like. And I believe when I look at the facial expression of what he depicted Jesus looking like, that's what really moved me more than all the blood on his body, because I thought of the anguish. Not just the physical anguish, but the mental anguish. And when I think about what Jesus said when he cried out at the 9th hour in the afternoon, more than likely had been there at least since 9 o'clock in the morning, he was in agony. Oh yes, physically in agony. But he cried out with a loud voice saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? He had come from the Father. He had come down from heaven. He and the Father were one from eternity. And now that eternal union was about to be severed as he took on the sins of the world. And folks, think about it. While he was on the cross, we were on his mind. Why was he dying? For the sins of the world. Every sin that every man ever committed was now upon his shoulders, and deep mental anguish that he is having to bear alone. He was still willing to submit his will to the will of his Father. Crucifixions were considered a shameful event, reserved for the worst of criminals. I'll read this in just a moment. It was the method of executing evildoers, criminals, and Jesus is being treated just like them. You know, really, crucifixion was illegal for Roman citizens, except in extreme cases. But from a Jewish perspective, crucifixion met the criteria of what we read in Deuteronomy 21, verse chapter 21, verse 22 through 23. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death and he is put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, for he who is hanged is accursed of God. And when a Hebrew committed a capital crime, he was executed and then hanged for the remainder of the day to demonstrate God's curse upon him. That's what we read in Galatians 3, verse 13. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Now consider the sinless Son of God submitting to such indignity and shame. Reflect on his restraint before the self-righteous high priest and Pilate, who was so pompous. Can you appreciate the humility, the dedication to the Father's will that this took? He came down from heaven enduring the cross. Hebrews 12 and verse 3, the Hebrew writer said, for consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Humility and dedication on his part, doing the will of his Father. And I believe that's what God is seeking in all of us, is humility and our willingness to dedicate our lives to him and for doing his will. Paul said in the Philippian letter, Philippians 2, verse 5 through 8, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. And there he's hanging on a tree, hanging on a cross for everyone to see. Where was his followers? They fled. They left. But I'll tell you what, there was one person there. There was one person there who knew him very well, that knew him when he was born. His mother. Can you imagine that? His mother, who 21 years earlier had said to him at the age of 12, son, what have you done? We have been looking for you. We're concerned about you. We love you. And now, looking what sinful man had done to her son. It's not just some nails in the hands and his feet. His whole body has been destroyed. Blood and water dripping to the ground. Oh, when they nailed him to the cross, his mother stood nearby. He said, woman, behold thy son. He cried out, thirst for water, but they gave him none to drink. Then the sinful work of man was done. To the howling mob he yielded. What if he had called 10,000 angels? You know, this song relates to what Jesus said to Peter. Do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? A Roman legion was 6,000 men. He could have called 1,000. He could have called 100. He could have called one. But he didn't. But he didn't. He did not. He could have stopped all that was happening to him. What would have been the outcome had he made that call? No crucifixion, no blood shed for the remission of my sins. There would not have been a gospel sermon preached on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. The church of Jesus Christ would not have been established on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem had he made that call and stopped everything that was going to him. We wouldn't be here today if he had stopped all that was happening to him. We wouldn't know each other. There'd be no gospel sermons, no gospel meetings. If he had made that call and stopped what was happening to him, no resurrection. Our faith is meaningless, empty. I believe we take it for granted what Jesus did for us. I do. If you have any hope for the future, it must be based upon the fact that you serve a risen Savior. Jesus died, and he is now alive. How did he survive the most difficult day while he was here upon the earth? I tell you how he did it. I believe he had his eyes fixed upon heaven, and so must we. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He did his work. He came down from heaven doing his Father's will. I am so grateful for that, aren't you? That's why I believe in him. That's why you believe in him. And our coming together on the first day of the week to what we're about to do, we are partaking of his supper. He said, do this in remembrance of me. Oh yes, that's what we're here to do.